dawn spilled like liquid gold over the ridges, spilling long shadows into the valley below. Frost clung to every blade of grass, each one sparkling as though the land itself had been dusted with shards of glass. Elias McGraw stood at the ridge's crest, a solitary figure outlined by the pale fire of morning. His breath billowed in slow clouds, and the cold bit at the edges of his beard. He had not planned to ride into town this early, but something in the air, the stillness broken by a faint, unnatural movement, made his boots pause mid-step. Beyond the wooden skeleton of the old saloon, something swayed. At first it seemed a banner left by careless hands, catching the wind. But as he narrowed his eyes, the movement grew sharper, heavier. Blonde hair caught the sunrise, almost too bright against the gray, weathered beams of the roofline. The shape was unmistakably human. Elias's jaw tightened. He crossed the frost-stiffened street with the sound of his steps echoing faintly between shuttered storefronts. The boards creaked beneath his weight as he mounted the saloon's porch, his eyes never leaving the figure. Her wrists were bound tight with frayed rope, her feet just brushing the roof's eaves. A plank nailed above her head bore burned letters, ugly and crude, Apache Lover. Her head hung forward, chin resting against her chest, but she was breathing. He could see the shallow rise and fall beneath her tattered dress. He didn't waste time. Climbing onto the rail, then pulling himself onto the low slant of the roof, he reached her in 3 silent strides. His hunting knife slid from its sheath, the steel whispering against leather. With one quick motion, he cut the rope. She crumpled against him as though her body had given up the idea of holding itself upright. Her skin was cold under his hands, and he caught the faint scent of smoke and sweat tangled in her hair. He lowered her carefully to the ground, and only then did he notice the gathering of townsfolk below. They came in ones and twos from shadowed doorways, faces pale in the chill. Murmurs threaded through them, small gusts of sound as sharp as the wind. Ruth Halloway, her bonnet tied tight beneath her chin, pushed to the front. "Let her lie where she's thrown herself," she said, voice dripping judgment. "That's what comes of keeping the wrong company." Elias ignored her. He knelt beside the woman, steadying her head with one calloused hand, searching her face for signs of deeper injury. Her eyes fluttered open, blue, though clouded with confusion and shame. Sheriff Amos Kettler stepped out from the small knot of onlookers, his coat buttoned tight, hat brim low. "McGraw," he said, voice slow as if each word weighed something, "best not involve yourself." She brought this on herself. Elias's gaze rose to meet the sheriff's, steady and unblinking. The silence stretched until Amos shifted on his boots and stepped aside, the words unsaid hanging heavier than the cold. Elias slipped his coat from his own shoulders, the coarse wool still holding the heat of his body, and wrapped it around her slight frame. She clutched it close, her fingers trembling. Without another glance at the crowd, he slid one arm beneath her knees, the other around her back, and lifted her as though she were no more than a child. Her head fell lightly against his shoulder. The street behind them dissolved into quiet as he walked toward the trail leading into the hills, the murmurs of the crowd fading into the scrape of wind through bare branches. The path was steep, winding between pines heavy with frost. The air changed the higher they climbed, thinning into something cleaner, touched by the scent of snowmelt. She stirred once, eyes half opening to the sound of his boots on stone. Her gaze drifted to the scar across his left knuckle, a thin white line like a scratch through old leather. She did not ask about it, and he did not speak. They reached the cabin just as the sun had pushed its way above the treeline. Built of timber darkened with age, it stood with a kind of stubborn dignity against the slope. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the smell of cedar into the cold air. Elias pushed the door open with his shoulder and stepped into the warmth. Inside was simple. A stone hearth with a low fire, shelves lined with jars and tools, a table scarred from years of use. He set her down in a chair near the fire, then moved without fuss to fill a mug from the blackened kettle. Steam rose, curling into the space between them. He offered it to her, and she took it with both hands, holding it as though afraid the heat might vanish if she moved too quickly. Her lips touched the rim, but she drank little. Her eyes wandered the cabin, pausing on the rifle resting in the corner, the boots by the door, the folded blankets stacked neatly on a bench. He busied himself with tending the fire, adding a split log and prodding the embers until they brightened. She tried to speak, but her voice caught. He glanced over his shoulder, then said, "No hurry?" And there was no hurry. The storm gathering in the west promised they would not leave the cabin soon. The day wore on in quiet. She dozed in the chair, waking once to the sound of him at the table, mending the leather strap of his satchel with patient stitches. Shadows lengthened on the cabin floor, the firelight painting everything in gold and amber. Outside, the wind began to rise, brushing against the windows with the soft hiss of snow-laden air. That night the storm broke. Snow rattled against the roof, the wind keening through the eaves. She stirred, pulling the coat tighter around herself, and found him watching the fire. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, softly, "Why'd you help me?" He didn't look at her right away. "No one should be left for the wolves," he said at last, "man or beast." His voice carried no heat, only certainty, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. She turned her gaze back to the fire. The warmth on her skin felt fragile, as though the world outside might still reach in and steal it away. But the coat on her shoulders, heavy and smelling faintly of cedar and smoke, told her she was safe, at least for now. Outside, the storm howled its threats against the wooden walls. Inside, the small cabin stood firm. She watched the snow beyond the glass until her eyes grew heavy. Somewhere in the distance, the town still held its whispers and its signs, the burned letters seared into wood. But here, there was only the fire, the steady rhythm of his movements, and the quiet space between words where something unspoken began to grow. Elias sat in the shadowed corner, his face unreadable, but his presence steady as the walls around them. The fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney, and she thought, though she could not say why, that the worst of the cold had passed. Yet she knew, in the marrow of her bones, that trouble would find its way up this mountain. For now, she closed her eyes, letting the sound of the storm carry her into a sleep that felt almost like peace. The snow had not yet melted when trouble found its way to the cabin. Morning light seeped pale through the frosted glass, casting a thin silver glow over the table where Elias sat sharpening his knife. Clara moved quietly behind him, folding the blanket she had used through the night. Neither spoke much these days, but the silences had changed, no longer edged with uncertainty, they carried the steady hum of shared breath and the unspoken weight of what each had endured. Still, there was a wariness in her gaze, as though she knew peace this far from town could not last. The crunch of hooves on frozen ground cut through the stillness. Elias set the knife down and stood, his eyes narrowing. Clara stilled, her hands frozen mid-fold. Outside, the shapes of 3 riders emerged between the snow-heavy pines. Deputy Wade Larkin was at their head, his hat pulled low, his smile nothing more than a slash across his face. Behind him, 2 men in long coats carried rifles slung loose in their hands. Wade reined in a few yards from the porch. "McGraw," he called, voice bright with a false friendliness. "Got business with the woman you're harboring." Elias stepped out onto the porch, the cold biting instantly at his skin. "She's not yours to claim. She's wanted for causing unrest," Wade replied. "You know how the folks in town are about outsiders stirring up the tribes." His gaze slid past Elias to the shadowed interior of the cabin. "Best you hand her over. You don't want to be on the wrong side of this." Clara stood just inside the doorway, her fingers curled tight around the edge of the frame. The tremor in her hands betrayed the steel in her eyes. She'd been bracing for this since the morning he'd cut her down from that roof. Elias didn't move. "You'll turn your horses and ride back while you still can," he said, voice low but carrying in the cold air. Wade's smile thinned. "You always did think yourself above the rest of us. Maybe we should remind you what happens when a man chooses the wrong company." The two men behind him shifted in their saddles, the leather creaking. But no shot came, and no further word was spoken. Wade jerked his chin toward the trail, and the riders wheeled around, disappearing into the trees. Inside, Clara pressed her back against the door. Her breath came in short bursts. "They'll be back." Elias met her gaze. "Then we'll be ready." It was only then that she spoke of the truth, of the boy she'd found 3 weeks before, half dead by the riverbank. He'd been no more than 16, his skin painted with drying blood, an arrow wound in his side. She had dragged him to her home, fed him, bound his injury as best she could. His words had been few, his eyes filled with something too old for his years. She never saw him again after he left under cover of night. 2 days later, Ruth Halloway had spotted the stains on her back steps and decided the rest of the story herself. "That's all it was," Clara said, her voice brittle. "I gave him food. I kept him alive. And now they call me—" She cut herself off, but the word hung there, bitter and unshakable. Elias's face revealed nothing, yet his stillness held an understanding deeper than sympathy. He knew what it was to be marked, to have a single act define you in the eyes of those too afraid to see more. In the days that followed, they prepared without speaking of the inevitability. Elias showed her how to load and unload the rifle, his hands guiding hers until the movements became second nature. She learned to bank the fire so its smoke would not betray them, and to listen for the smallest shift in the forest's rhythm. In the quiet stretches of those days, they moved around each other with a growing ease, her mending the seams of his worn shirts, him setting aside the larger logs so she would not strain to lift them. One evening, as snow drifted lazily from a sky the color of ash, she began to hum, a tune from a life far behind her now. Elias didn't speak, only sat in his chair by the fire, the sound settling into the space like a thread sewing the air closed against the cold. Their eyes met briefly, and in that look was a recognition that neither dared name. The night they returned, it was without warning. Clara had been tending the fire when the sharp report of hooves broke through the wind. Elias took his rifle from its rest and moved to the window. 5 riders this time. Wade among them, his face hard in the moonlight. They shouted for her, their voices slicing through the cold, threats, insults, demands. Elias stepped out into the snow, his boots sinking deep, the breath from man and horse alike rising in silver clouds. "Last chance, McGraw," Wade called. "Hand her over, or we'll take her." The answer came in the split second of a rifle's crack. Elias's shot struck Wade's weapon, splintering the stock from his hands. The sudden noise startled the horses. 2 of the men swore and pulled their mounts back. The others circled wide, trying to come from behind. Inside, Clara heard the crunch of footsteps on the far side of the cabin. She gripped the shotgun as Elias had taught her, the weight solid and cold in her hands. The door on that side swung open before she could think twice. A man stood framed in the pale wash of snowlight, his expression twisted with something between anger and hunger. "No closer," she said, the words steady despite the thundering in her chest. He hesitated, glancing toward the sounds of scuffle outside. The barrel of the shotgun didn't waver. After a long breath, he stepped back into the storm, the wind swallowing him. By the time Elias returned, the clearing was empty save for the churned snow and the settling hush of night. He shut the door behind him and leaned his rifle against the wall. Clara set the shotgun down gently. The air inside the cabin felt thick, holding the echo of what might have been. They didn't speak for a while. Elias tended the fire, feeding it slow, deliberate logs. Clara sank into the chair opposite him, her gaze following the rise of flame. Something had shifted, not in the danger, for that still lingered like the shadow of smoke, but in the thread between them. When their eyes met, there was no need for thanks or promises. The choice had already been made, somewhere in the quiet acts of the past days. The folding of a blanket, the careful loading of a rifle, the listening to a tune hummed against the backdrop of snow. The wind pressed at the cabin walls, but the fire held, steady and bright. Outside, the night reclaimed its stillness. Inside, they remained, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as two people who had stood against the cold together, and would again, if the need came.